Hi, first grade. Today we are starting our final unit of CKLA, and it is called Frontier Explorers. Today's story is Daniel Boone and the Opening of the West. Our learning objectives for today are to put historical topics about North America in sequential order, describe Daniel Boone and the Appalachian Mountains, demonstrate an understanding of the word barrier, describe why the Appalachian Mountains were a barrier for settlers, and then identify the Appalachian Mountains on a map and describe why they were a barrier for settlers. Our key vocabulary today, we've got barrier, claimed, frontier, settlements, and woodsman. Barrier. A barrier is something that blocks movement from one place to another. The Appalachian Mountains were a natural barrier to moving west. Claimed. Claimed means to have said something belongs to you, even if others might not agree. Thomas claimed the basketball was his, even though it did not have his name written on it. Frontier. Frontier is the area of North America that is west of the Appalachian Mountains that had not yet been explored or settled by the European settlers. Okay, Lewis and Clark explored the frontier. If you look at our map of the United States, you see this red line that is, or that shows you where the Appalachian Mountains are. Okay, they start in Georgia and they go all the way up to Maine. And remember that the frontier is the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if we were to draw a little compass here, we've got north, east, south, and west. So we are looking at all of the land that is west, so this way of the Appalachian Mountains. So we are talking about all that land, okay? All of that land had not yet been explored or settled by the European settlers. Okay, let's go back to my pen. All right, settlements. Settlements are places where people make their homes in a new area. The families decided to leave their homes in Europe and move to the settlements in America. Woodsmen. Woodsmen are people who live or work in the forest. The woodsmen were able to build shelters out of tree branches. So in this unit, we are going to learn about how the United States grew in size and how its growth affected Native Americans, settlers, and the landscape. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to look at this picture. What do you see in this picture? Native Americans. And what about in this picture? Christopher Columbus. And this one? Pilgrims. And what about in this last one? The Declaration of Independence, exactly. So today we are going to hear about one of the first explorers of the American West, Daniel Boone. Remember our key vocabulary, we have barrier, claimed, frontier, settlements, and woodsman. All right, today I want you to listen carefully to find out about one of the difficulties or challenges faced by Daniel Boone and other people who wanted to move west. Today, people from all over the world live together in communities from one end of the North American continent to the other, from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, and everywhere in between. Okay, so nowadays people live from anywhere from this side of the North American continent all the way to this side of the North American continent. This map of North America shows the United States in green. You can see lots of thin white lines outlining the states that make up our country, the United States of America. However, hundreds of years ago, the map of the United States was much smaller than it is today. Long, long ago, the only people who lived on the continent of North America were people now known as Native Americans. Native Americans have lived in North America for thousands of years. Native Americans lived in both seasonal and permanent villages. They used great knowledge of the land and its resources to create a number of villages and cultures. At the same time, far away on the other side of the ocean, many other people had their own towns and villages. These people lived on the continent of Europe and were known as Europeans. Okay. This right here is Europe in the yellow. Okay. About 600 years ago, Europeans began to leave their lands to sail to other parts of the world, seeking spices, gold, and other riches. Some of these explorers arrived in North America. Remember, North America is over here in purple. Imagine how surprised Native Americans and other Europeans must have been to see each other. People who looked, dressed, and spoke very differently than themselves. The early explorers who came to North America were mostly interested in finding goods and riches that they could take back to Europe and sell. Many of these explorers learned vital skills from Native Americans who knew the land very well. Native Americans taught the Europeans many skills, including hunting, fishing, gathering, and farming. In exchange for their help, Europeans brought things to trade with Native Americans, such as cloth. For many years, Europeans traveled back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Some Europeans were content or satisfied to just trade with Native Americans, but others became interested in starting settlements because they wanted to live on the continent as well. Remember that settlements are places where people live, okay? They're making their homes in a new area. The English started two early settlements in North America in the 1600s. Plymouth in what is now Massachusetts and Jamestown in what is now Virginia. Hey, did we learn about those two things already this year? Yeah, this stuff is also stuff that we learned in our previous unit, right? With the 13 colonies. At Plymouth, Native Americans helped the settlers survive. Do you remember how at Plymouth they celebrated with their harvest together, the first Thanksgiving in America? The Europeans would not have been able to grow the corn or squash for that meal without the help from Native Americans. As time passed, more and more Europeans came to live in North America, often encroaching on Native American land, or gradually taking all of the Native American land. Fights over the land arose, and eventually, settlers claimed most of the land on the east coast of North America, land where the Native Americans had lived for many years. Okay, so they came over and they took over the land of the Native Americans. The English formed colonies or settlements controlled by faraway England from Massachusetts all the way to Georgia. So, same thing that we talked about before. Even though we had settlements from Massachusetts to Georgia, they were still being ruled by the British at that point. Eventually, some of the more adventurous settlers wanted to explore land to the west of them. One of these people was a great young man named Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was born in 1734 near the town of Reading, Pennsylvania. His father and mother owned a farm. Daniel and his brothers and sisters all helped their parents to plow the fields on the farm. But Daniel was never content in the open fields. He was curious about life in the woods around their farm and spent as much time as possible creating paths through the forest. He made friends with young Native American boys who lived in the wooded areas. They taught Daniel how to move silently through the forest and how to trap wild animals and catch fish in the streams. Daniel learned how to use a knife and a tomahawk at an early age. His father, seeing how interested Daniel was in hunting, taught Daniel how to use a special type of gun called a rifle. It was common back then for people to learn hunting and survival skills because it was very different. Their life way back then was very different than it is now. Today, most people have the option to buy food and other things rather than hunting for those resources themselves. One day, while helping his father plow the fields, Daniel asked if he could be allowed to help out the family in another way. "Father," he asked, "since you taught me how to shoot a rifle, I have practiced and I've practiced until I am the best shot for miles around. Let me hunt for food for our family." Daniel's father agreed, and soon the Boones were feasting on wild turkey and deer. In 1770, just before Daniel turned 16, the Boone family moved from Pennsylvania to the Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina, settling at the edge of the frontier. Hey! The Yadkin River is not too far from us. It did not take long for the other settlers in his new home to discover that Daniel was one of the best woodsmen for miles around. Remember that woodsmen are people who live or work in the forest. Daniel Boone lived and worked in the forest. Daniel began to explore his new surroundings. His explorations took him deep into the forest. He heard tales of buffalo to the west and wanted to try hunting other animals than the plentiful deer and bear that lived in the woods nearby. But Daniel was unable to go as far west as he wanted to go. Something was stopping him and other settlers from traveling farther west. Can you guess what it was? What do you think was stopping them? Let's see. They were enormous mountains standing in his way. These mountains are called the Appalachian Mountains, and they stretch for miles from the present-day state of Maine all the way to Georgia. The mountains were heavily wooded, making them difficult to cross. They formed a natural barrier and blocked movement from one side of the mountains to the other. For this reason, few European settlers had left their colonies along the eastern coast of North America to travel west. But Daniel knew that Native Americans had crisscrossed these mountains for years. As he roamed through the densely forested hillsides, his curiosity about lands to the west grew stronger. Daniel began to ask everyone he met if they knew a way to cross the mountains. And that is the end of our story for today. All right, so I want you to look at this picture. And I want you to tell me, do you know where the Appalachian Mountains are? Do you know what states they go through? Maine all the way through Georgia, or Georgia all the way through Maine. Okay. Where did Daniel Boone live? He lived on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, and then later they moved to North Carolina. Where did Daniel Boone want to go? West. Do you remember why? To explore and find new animals to hunt that he had heard about. What kept the English settlers from moving farther west across North America? The Appalachian Mountains. Okay. How would you describe Daniel Boone? Daniel Boone, he was a good hunter, right, and woodsman, and he was really curious about how to travel west across the Appalachian Mountains. Do you think that he's going to find his way across the mountains? We'll have to see in the next read aloud and see if you're right. In the read aloud you heard, the Appalachian Mountains formed a natural barrier and blocked movement from one side of the mountains to the other. Say the word barrier for me. Barrier. Can you clap it out? Barrier. Ooh, how many syllables did it have? 3. Barrier. A barrier is something that blocks movement from one place to another. A barrier can be natural or man-made. The police set up a barrier to block the road during a crime scene investigation. What's the word we've been talking about? Barrier. I'm going to describe something. If the item is something that is a barrier, I want you to say, that is a barrier. If the item is something that is not a barrier, I want you to say, that is not a barrier. Remember to answer in complete sentences. A large, wide river with no bridges across. That is a barrier. That would make it difficult for you to cross the river. A piece of paper on the ground. That is not a barrier. Construction barrels in the middle of the road. That is a barrier. A tree that has fallen across the highway. That is a barrier. And a rug on the floor. That's not a barrier. Alrighty, let's make sure we hit those learning objectives. Did we put historical topics about North America in sequential order? Yes, we talked about it, but you're going to do it for your Nearpod in just a minute. Did we describe Daniel Boone and the Appalachian Mountains? We did. Did we demonstrate an understanding of the word barrier? Yes. Did we describe why the Appalachian Mountains were a barrier for settlers? Yes. And then also in your Nearpod, you are going to identify the Appalachian Mountains on a map and then describe why they were a barrier for the settlers. Okay, see you next time. Bye.